The crystal stemware caught the light from David's dining room chandelier, casting tiny rainbows across the mahogany table. Maggie traced the rim of her untouched wine glass while her son pontificated about responsible financial planning for seniors. "The thing is, Mom," David said, his voice carrying that particular tone he'd perfected as a child when explaining why she was wrong, "at your age, you really need to think practically about your remaining years." Remaining years. Maggie's fingers tightened around the glass stem. At 65, she had perhaps 20 good years left, maybe more. But David spoke as if she were already counting down to single digits. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, shooting Maggie an apologetic look. "David, that's not really—" "I'm just being realistic," he interrupted, dabbing his mouth with the linen napkin. "Mom, you've got a comfortable setup. Dad's insurance took care of everything. You don't need to go chasing after adventures." The word dripped with condescension. Maggie had made the mistake of mentioning, during the appetizer course, that she'd been thinking about traveling. Maybe taking a pottery class. Simple things that had felt enormous in her quiet house, but now seemed embarrassingly small under her eldest son's scrutiny. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I wasn't talking about climbing Everest, David. Maggie's voice carried an edge. I mentioned Europe, museums, maybe a cooking class in Tuscany. David's laugh was sharp. Mom, be serious. You've never traveled alone. You can barely manage the smartphone Rebecca got you. Heat flushed Maggie's cheeks. The phone did mystify her, but that didn't mean she was incapable of learning. There are senior tour groups, she said quietly. Organized trips designed for people my age. Exactly. David leaned forward, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Senior activities, age-appropriate pursuits. There's that book club at St. Mark's, all widows, nice ladies your age. Or you could volunteer at the hospital. Something meaningful but safe. Safe. The word sat heavy in Maggie's chest. When had safety become the only consideration? When had the boundaries of her world shrunk to the distance between her house and the grocery store? Your father always said you had more sense than to go gallivanting around the world, David continued. He'd want you to act your age, not chase. After some fantasy like you're 20 again. The silence stretched taut. Sarah's fork clinked against her plate. Act my age, Maggie repeated slowly, tasting the bitter words. And what exactly does that mean, David? Her son's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing he'd pushed too far. But he didn't back down. It means accepting reality. You're 65 years old, Mom. A widow. You've got grandchildren who need their grandmother to be stable, present, not off having some midlife crisis. Midlife? Despite everything, Maggie almost smiled. That would make me quite the optimist about my lifespan. You know what I mean. David's patience was wearing thin. Dad's been gone barely a year. You're still grieving. This isn't the time to make impulsive decisions. Impulsive. Another word that stung. Maggie couldn't remember the last time she'd done anything truly impulsive. 43 years of marriage, 3 children, decades of teaching, none of it had been impulsive. It had all been careful, considered, responsible. Maybe we could look into some local activities first, Sarah interjected gently. The community center has pottery classes for seniors, Maggie finished flatly. Chair yoga, watercolor painting, all very safe, very age-appropriate. David nodded approvingly. Exactly. There's no shame in embracing your stage of life. Mom, you've earned the right to slow down, enjoy your golden years. Golden years. Another euphemism for the gradual narrowing of possibilities, the gentle slide toward irrelevance. Maggie had spent 3 years watching her husband disappear, Into Alzheimer's fog, she'd learned what it meant to become invisible, to exist solely as a caregiver, to have her identity subsumed entirely into someone else's needs. And now, finally free, she was being told to embrace more of the same. The rest of the dinner passed, in stilted conversation about safe topics: Rebecca's grades, Sarah's therapy practice, David's latest case. Maggie smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, but her mind wandered to the boxes in her bedroom closet. Frank's belongings, mostly, waiting to be donated, but buried beneath were her things: her abandoned thesis notes from graduate school, the acceptance letter to the PhD program she'd turned down to marry young. By 9:30, Maggie was back in her own house, silence pressing against her ears. She moved through familiar rooms, straightening pillows that didn't need straightening, checking locks already secure. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time that felt simultaneously endless and desperately finite. In her bedroom, she stared at the closet door before opening it. The boxes were there, just as she'd left them. She pulled out the one marked Maggie School in her younger self's careful handwriting. The manila folder was yellowed at the edges, but the papers inside were still crisp. Her master's thesis proposal on women's voices in early American literature. Research notes scrawled in margins. A letter from her advisor encouraging her to pursue doctoral studies. "You have a unique perspective and a sharp analytical mind," he'd written. "The academic world needs voices like yours." She'd been so close, just a thesis defense away from her master's degree, with a clear path to continue. But Frank had proposed, and the future had seemed so certain. Graduate school could wait. There would be time later. Later had never come. Maggie sat on the bed's edge, holding the old papers like artifacts from someone else's life. Maybe that young woman with her academic dreams was as gone as Frank, another casualty of time and responsibility. But what if she wasn't? The thought came unbidden, dangerous. Maggie moved to Frank's desk, where her laptop sat closed and dusty. It took several tries to remember the password, their anniversary date. The screen flickered to life, displaying her desktop wallpaper, a photo of her and Frank from their last good trip together, both laughing at something she could no longer remember. She opened the browser and, almost without thinking, typed Harvard Extension School into the search bar. The website was sleek, modern, filled with smiling faces of students who looked nothing like her. But as she clicked through pages, reading about degree programs and course offerings, something stirred in her chest. The literature program offered exactly the classes she'd dreamed about 40 years ago. Contemporary American fiction, post-colonial literature, women's voices in narrative. She found herself clicking on the admissions page. The requirements were straightforward: undergraduate degree, personal statement, letters of recommendation. She had the degree, buried somewhere, the recommendations. While some former colleagues were still teaching, the personal statement was the challenge. What could she possibly say? That she was a 65-year-old widow looking to reclaim dreams she'd abandoned before most potential classmates were born? But her fingers were already moving across the keyboard, words flowing as if they'd been waiting decades to be written. She wrote about literature as a lifeline during her husband's illness, how books had kept her tethered to herself when caregiving threatened to erase her identity. She wrote about the hunger for intellectual challenge that had never quite died, the conversations with long-dead authors that felt more real than most exchanges with living people. She wrote about the woman she'd been at 22, and the woman she was now, and the possibility that they might not be so different after all. When she finished, it was nearly 2 a.m. The house was utterly silent except for the old furnace cycling on. Maggie read through her essay twice, making small corrections, hardly believing she'd written it. It felt like someone else's words, someone braver than she'd ever been. The application sat complete on her screen, cursor hovering over the submit button. All she had to do was click. One simple action that would either change everything or change nothing at all. She thought about David's voice, the way he'd said, "act your age," like both instruction and ultimatum. She thought about the pottery classes and book clubs that were supposed to fill her remaining years with appropriate, safe activities. She thought about Frank, not as he'd been at the end, confused and frightened, but as he'd been in the beginning. The young man who'd fallen in love with her mind, who'd spent hours discussing books and ideas with her, who'd supported her dreams even when it meant delaying his own. What would he want for her now? Really want, not the sanitized version David liked to invoke when it served his purposes. Maggie closed her eyes, took a breath that seemed to fill her entire body, and clicked submit. The confirmation page appeared instantly. "Thank you for your application to Harvard Extension School. You will receive notification of our decision within 6 to 8 weeks." She stared at the screen until it blurred, hardly believing what she'd done. Somewhere in Cambridge, her application would land in a pile with hundreds of others. Someone would read her words, consider her qualifications, make a decision about her worthiness. But as she finally closed the laptop and prepared for bed, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the electric thrill of possibility. Whatever happened next, she had dared to imagine a different future. She had refused, for one night at least, to act her age. The application was submitted. There was no taking it back now. The morning after submitting her application, Maggie woke with the disorienting sensation of having crossed an invisible threshold. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the air. For a moment, she lay still, wondering if the previous night had been an elaborate dream. But the laptop on Frank's desk, still, closed but somehow different now, confirmed the reality of what she'd done. She moved through her morning routine with careful normalcy. Coffee, toast, the morning news playing to an empty kitchen. But underneath the familiar rhythms, electricity hummed through her veins. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward the laptop, as if it might spontaneously announce Harvard's response. The first week passed in a haze of forced routine. Maggie maintained her usual schedule with military precision. Grocery, shopping on Tuesday, volunteer work at the library on Wednesday, dinner with Sarah's family on Friday. She attended her book club meeting at St. Mark's, listening to the other widows discuss their latest romance novel selection, while her mind wandered to syllabi and lecture halls. "You seem distracted, dear," Mrs. Henderson observed after Maggie offered a particularly vague comment about the protagonist's character development. "Are you feeling all right?" "Just tired," Maggie replied, which was true enough. She'd been sleeping poorly, her dreams filled with lecture halls where she sat among 20-somethings, her gray hair marking her as an interloper in a world of youth and possibility. By the second week, the secrecy began to feel like a physical weight. David called twice, checking on her with the casual concern of someone monitoring an elderly relative for signs of decline. Sarah stopped by unannounced with homemade soup and worried eyes, clearly still processing their mother's sudden interest in adventures. "You've seemed different lately," Sarah said, settling into Frank's old chair with her tea. "Distant somehow. Are you sure you're okay?" Maggie's fingers tightened around her mug. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just processing things." "The anniversary of Dad's diagnosis is coming up," Sarah said gently. "I know that's always hard." The anniversary. Maggie had forgotten, which itself felt like a small betrayal. 3 years ago, they'd received the Alzheimer's diagnosis that would reshape their lives completely. 3 years of watching Frank disappear, piece by piece of becoming a caregiver first and a wife second, then finally neither at all. "Maybe we should plan something," Sarah continued. "A memorial service or just family dinner, something to mark the day." Maggie nodded absently, but her mind was elsewhere. 3 years ago, she'd put her life on hold to care for Frank. It had been the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But now, Faced with the possibility of reclaiming that postponed life, the guilt felt crushing. The third week brought obsessive research. While maintaining her outward routine, Maggie spent hours exploring Harvard's website, memorizing campus maps, reading course descriptions with the intensity of a scholar preparing for comprehensive exams. She discovered the Extension School's evening and weekend classes, designed for working adults and non-traditional students. The realization that she wouldn't be the only older face in classrooms filled her with relief and terror in equal measure. She found herself bookmarking apartment listings near Harvard Square, then immediately deleting her browser history as if David might materialize to check her computer. The prices were staggering, more than she'd paid for her first house, but Frank's insurance had left her comfortable. Money, at least, wouldn't be the barrier. Late one evening, while researching student housing options, Maggie's phone rang. Tommy's name appeared on the screen, and she answered with unusual eagerness. "Hey, Mom, how are you holding up?" "I'm good," she said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "How's the community center project coming along?" "Slow but steady. You know how it is. Bureaucracy and budget constraints." Tommy's voice carried the patient optimism that had sustained him through years of disappointment. "Listen, I was thinking about coming by this weekend. Maybe we could grab lunch, just the two of us." Maggie's heart jumped. Of all her children, Tommy was the one who might understand what she was contemplating. He'd spent his entire adult life pursuing dreams that others deemed impractical, weathering criticism and financial instability in service of something larger than security. "I'd like that," she said. "Tommy, can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you ever regret it? Choosing art over conventional success?" There was a pause, and Maggie could picture him considering the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "Some days," he admitted. "When the rent's due and I'm eating ramen for the third night running. But then I see a kid discover they can paint or watch a mural bring a community together, and I remember why I chose this path. Even when people think you're foolish? Especially then." His voice softened. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound, I don't know, different." Maggie closed her eyes, the laptop screen glowing before her with images of ivy-covered buildings and determined student faces. "I'm thinking about making some changes in my life. Nothing dramatic, just exploring new possibilities." "Good for you," Tommy said without hesitation. "Dad wouldn't want you to stop living just because he's gone." The words hit Maggie like a gentle blow. Frank wouldn't want her to stop living. But would he want her to start over so completely? After hanging up, she found herself drawn to the framed photograph on Frank's nightstand. It showed them on their wedding day, impossibly young and radiant with certainty. Frank's eyes held the same intelligence that had first attracted her, the same curiosity about the world that had made their conversations sparkle with possibility. "What would you think of all this?" she whispered to the photograph. "Your practical wife applying to Harvard at 65? The silence that followed felt expectant rather than empty, as if Frank were considering his response with characteristic deliberation. Her laptop chimed with an email notification, and Maggie's heart stopped. But it was just a newsletter from the library, not the life-changing message she both craved and dreaded. The waiting was becoming unbearable. Every morning brought the same ritual: coffee, email check, crushing disappointment. Harvard's website promised 6 to 8 weeks for admissions decisions, but it had been only 3. Time moved differently when you were counting down to potential transformation. On a gray Thursday morning in the 4th week, Maggie was reorganizing Frank's closet, a task she'd been avoiding for months, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, with a Massachusetts area code that made her pulse quicken. "Mrs. Coleman? This is Dr. Patricia Henley from Harvard Extension School." Maggie sank onto the bed, surrounded by Frank's carefully folded sweaters. "Yes?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm calling about your application for our literature program. I have to say, your personal statement was quite compelling. We don't often receive applications from students with your unique perspective. Unique perspective. Was that academic code for elderly oddity? I wanted to discuss a few details with you, Dr. Henley continued. Your undergraduate transcripts show excellent work, though it's been some time since you were in an academic environment. Are you prepared for the rigor of graduate-level coursework? I believe so, Maggie said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. I've continued reading and writing throughout my career as an educator. Yes, I see you taught high school English for 30 years. Impressive tenure. And your research proposal on women's voices in contemporary literature shows real promise. There was a pause. Mrs. Coleman, I'll be frank with you. Admissions was divided on your application. Some committee members were concerned about your age and the gap in your formal education. Maggie's heart sank. Here it came. The gentle rejection. The suggestion that she pursue age-appropriate activities instead. However, Dr. Henley continued, I advocated strongly for your admission. Your life experience and perspective could bring tremendous value to our program. I'm pleased to inform you that you've been accepted into Harvard Extension School's Master of Liberal Arts program with a concentration in literature. The words seemed to hang in the air, rearranging themselves slowly into meaning. Accepted, Harvard, at 65. Mrs. Coleman, are you there? Yes, Maggie whispered. Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much. Classes begin in 8 weeks. You'll receive your official acceptance packet within a few days, along with registration information and housing resources. Do you have any immediate questions? Maggie looked around Frank's closet, at the life she'd built and maintained for decades, at the photograph of their wedding day visible through the doorway. Just one, she said. Am I completely insane for doing this? Dr. Henley's laugh was warm and conspiratorial. Mrs. Coleman, in my experience, the best students are always a little insane. Welcome to Harvard. After hanging up, Maggie sat in the profound silence of her bedroom, acceptance washing over her in waves. She'd done it. Actually done it. At 65, she was going back to school. Not just any school, but Harvard. The impossibility of it made her laugh out loud, a sound that echoed strangely in the quiet house. She reached for Frank's photograph, holding it with trembling hands. I got in, she told him. Can you believe it? I actually got in. For a moment, she could almost hear his response, could almost see the pride and amazement that would have lit his face. Frank had always believed in her potential, even when she'd forgotten it herself. But with acceptance came the crushing weight of reality. She had 8 weeks to tell her family, arrange her life, and prepare for the biggest change she'd made since marriage. 8 weeks to transform from Richmond widow to Harvard student. The phone was in her hand before she'd made a conscious decision to call, and Tommy answered on the second ring. Mom, is everything okay? Tommy, she said, and her voice was shaking with laughter and terror in equal measure. I need to tell you something, and you're going to think I've completely lost my mind. I need to tell you something, and you're going to think I've completely lost my mind. Tommy's concerned silence stretched across the phone line, and Maggie could picture him in his cluttered studio apartment, probably covered in paint from his latest community mural project. Mom, you're scaring me. Are you sick? Is it... No, nothing like that. Maggie took a shaky breath. Tommy, I applied to Harvard, and I got in. The silence that followed was so complete she wondered if the call had dropped. Then Tommy's laugh erupted, rich and delighted. Holy shit, Mom. Sorry, I mean holy cow. Harvard? Really? Really? Saying it aloud made it feel more real, more terrifyingly wonderful. The extension school, master's in literature. Classes start in 8 weeks. That's incredible. Mom, this is amazing. You're going to be a Harvard student at 65. Do you know how badass that is? His enthusiasm wrapped around her like a warm blanket, but underneath lay the cold knowledge of what came next. I haven't told David and Sarah yet. Ah. Tommy's tone shifted, understanding flooding his voice. And you want me there when you do. Sunday brunch at Sarah's. I thought, safety in numbers? Absolutely. I'll be there. And Mom, I'm proud of you. This is the coolest thing anyone in our family has ever done. Sunday morning arrived gray and humid, typical Virginia weather that matched Maggie's churning stomach. She'd spent the weekend rehearsing different versions of her announcement, but none felt adequate. How did you casually mention over eggs, Benedict, that you were upending your entire life? Sarah's house buzzed with its usual weekend chaos. Her teenage twins, Emma and Jake, moved through the kitchen like friendly hurricanes, grabbing food and disappearing to their rooms. Sarah fluttered around the dining room, setting out her grandmother's china with the nervous energy of someone hosting dignitaries. Mom, you look nice, Sarah said, kissing Maggie's cheek. Is that a new blouse? It was, actually. A small rebellion purchased yesterday during a moment of optimism. Royal blue silk that brought out her eyes, the kind of thing she'd stopped buying years ago. Thank you, dear. David arrived precisely at 11, as always, Rebecca trailing behind him with the resigned expression of a teenager conscripted for family duty. At 16, Rebecca had inherited her father's sharp intelligence, but lacked his need to control everything around her. Grandma Maggie! Rebecca brightened genuinely, giving Maggie a fierce hug that smelled of vanilla perfume and teenage possibility. Dad made me come because he said you've been acting strange lately. I told him you probably just needed space to figure out your life. Out of the mouths of babes. David shot his daughter a warning look. Rebecca doesn't understand the complexities. Where's Tommy? Sarah interrupted, clearly desperate to avoid conflict before they'd even sat down. Here. Tommy's voice came from the kitchen door, and Maggie felt her shoulders relax slightly. He wore his good jeans and a button-down shirt, his version of formal wear, and his smile was steady and encouraging. They gathered around Sarah's polished dining table, passing platters of food with the careful politeness that marked family meals when tension lurked beneath the surface. David discussed a case he was working on. Sarah updated everyone on Emma's college preparations. Rebecca texted under the table until David confiscated her phone. Maggie pushed food around her plate, waiting for the right moment. But when was the right moment to detonate a bomb? Mom, you've barely touched your food, Sarah observed. Are you feeling all right? Actually, Maggie said, setting down her fork with a decisive clink, there's something I need to tell you all. The table went quiet. David's lawyer instincts sharpened, visibly alert to incoming trouble. Sarah's face arranged itself into therapeutic neutrality. Tommy leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, ready for battle. I've made a decision about my future, Maggie began. I know you've all been concerned about how I'm adjusting, what I should be doing with my time. Well, I've figured it out. Good, David said cautiously. The volunteer work at the hospital, or maybe that book club. No. The word came out sharper than intended. I'm going back to school, to Harvard. The silence that followed felt explosive. Sarah blinked rapidly. David's face went through several expressions before settling on something between disbelief and concern. Rebecca's mouth fell open. Tommy grinned. Tell them about the acceptance letter, Mom. Acceptance letter? David's voice rose dangerously. What acceptance letter? I applied to Harvard Extension School 6 weeks ago, Maggie said, her voice gaining strength with each word. I was accepted into their Master of Liberal Arts program with a concentration in literature. Classes begin in August. David's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table. This is a joke, right? Some kind of, I don't know, early onset dementia symptom? David, Sarah gasped. I'm 65 years old, Maggie said evenly. Not senile. Mom, this is... David ran his hands through his hair, his careful composure cracking. This is insane. You can't just decide to become a college student at your age. It's not practical. It's not safe. Here we go, Tommy muttered. And what's that supposed to mean? David rounded on his younger brother. It means you can't. Control Mom the way you try to control everything else in your life. Control? David's voice hit a pitch that made Rebecca wince. I'm trying to protect her from making a catastrophic mistake. She's a 65-year-old widow who hasn't been in school for 40 years. She'll be living alone in a strange city, surrounded by kids young enough to be her grandchildren. What happens when she can't keep up? When she fails out? When she gets hurt? What if she succeeds? Rebecca said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at the teenager, who was looking at her grandmother with something like awe. I mean, Rebecca continued, emboldened by the attention, what if Grandma actually does really well? What if she loves it? What if she makes friends and learns amazing things and becomes like, I don't know, the coolest grandmother ever? Rebecca, you don't understand, David began. I understand that you're scared, Rebecca shot back with startling insight. You're scared that if Grandma changes her life, it means you have to question yours. But just because you're miserable doesn't mean she has to be. The words hung in the air like an accusation. David's face went white, then red. That's enough, he said quietly, dangerously. Rebecca, you're grounded. And Mom. He turned to Maggie with the expression of someone delivering a dire diagnosis. This stops now. I'm calling Dr. Morrison. You clearly need a psychological evaluation. No. Maggie's voice cut through his tirade like a blade. You will not call my doctor. You will not have me evaluated. You will not make decisions about my mental health or my future. Mom, please, Sarah tried to interject. David's just worried. We all are. This is so sudden, so unlike you. Unlike me? Maggie stood, her chair scraping against the floor. Or unlike who you think I should be? The quiet widow who volunteers? Appropriately? And never causes trouble? You're dishonoring Dad's memory, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Running off to play college student like some teenage fantasy. Dad believed in responsibility, in family duty. He'd be ashamed of this selfishness. The words hit Maggie like physical blows, but instead of crumbling, she felt something crystallize inside her. Something that had been building for weeks, maybe years. Don't you dare, she said, her voice low and steady. Use your father's memory to justify your fear of change. Frank would be proud of me for having the courage to grow, to learn, to become more than just a memorial to our marriage. He'd want you here, with your family. He'd want me to be happy. The words rang with absolute certainty. Frank fell in love with my mind, with my curiosity, with my dreams. He mourned with me when I gave up graduate school, even though he never asked me to. He would celebrate this decision, not condemn it. David's face contorted with frustration. Fine, go to Harvard. Embarrass yourself and our family. But don't expect me to support this delusion. Don't expect me to pick up the pieces when it all falls apart. I'm not asking you to, Maggie replied calmly. I'm informing you. There's a difference. The silence that followed felt fragile, pregnant with the possibility of irreparable damage. Then Tommy cleared his throat. For what it's worth, he said, looking directly at David, I think Mom is incredibly brave. I think she's doing exactly what she should be doing. And if you can't see that, if you can't support the people you claim to love when they need it most, then maybe you're the one who needs to examine your choices. Easy for you to say, David shot back. You've never had real responsibilities. You've never had to make adult decisions. I've made the decision to live authentically, Tommy interrupted. Even when it's hard. Even when people I love think, I'm making mistakes. That's more adult than hiding behind conventional expectations. Rebecca had been watching this exchange with growing excitement. Now she turned to her grandmother with shining eyes. Grandma, this is so cool. You're going to be a Harvard student. Can I visit you? Can I see your dorm room? Rebecca, David warned. Dad, stop, Rebecca said with sudden maturity. Grandma's right. You are scared. You're scared that if she can change her whole life at 65, then maybe all your excuses about being stuck in yours don't really mean anything. The truth of it silenced the room. David stared at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time, his face cycling. Through anger, hurt, and something that might have been recognition, Sarah, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke. Mom, I have to ask. Are you sure about this? Really, truly sure? Because if you're doing this to prove something, or because you're running from grief, I'm running toward life, Maggie said simply. For the first time in years, I feel alive. I feel like myself again. Not your mother, not Frank's widow, not David's problem to manage. Myself, Margaret Coleman, who has things to say and learn and become. She looked around the table at her family, her children's faces reflecting various degrees of concern, confusion, and in Rebecca's case, admiration. Tommy's steady support, the wreckage of what should have been a pleasant Sunday brunch. I leave for Cambridge in 6 weeks, she said quietly. I hope you'll all find a way to support this decision. But if you can't, I'll understand, and I'll go anyway. The words settled over the table like a final verdict. In the silence that followed, Maggie could hear the tick of Sarah's mantel clock, the distant sound of traffic, the ordinary world continuing its rhythm while her family absorbed the reality of her transformation. She had said it, out loud, in front of everyone. There was no taking it back now, no pretending this was just a momentary impulse. She was going to Harvard, whether they understood or not. The storm had broken. Now came the reckoning with whatever remained. 2 months after the storm at Sarah's dining table, Maggie stood on a Cambridge sidewalk with a single suitcase, staring up at the narrow brownstone that would be her home. The late August heat pressed against her shoulders, but she shivered, anyway, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd done. The studio apartment was on the 3rd floor, smaller than her walk-in closet back home, but hers. For the first time since marriage, she lived alone by choice rather than circumstance. Her laptop sat on the tiny desk, loaded with syllabi that both thrilled and intimidated her. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. First day of college for both of us. You're going to crush it, Grandma. Another from Tommy. Remember what? We practiced. Deep breath, shoulders back, you belong there. Morning arrived gray and humid. Maggie dressed carefully in dark slacks and a blue sweater, professional but not overly formal. The walk to campus took 20 minutes, longer than planned because she got lost twice. Harvard Yard buzzed with returning students, their faces bright with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their right to be there. She found her first classroom in Seaver Hall, arriving 5 minutes early, the room filled with impossibly young students. Professor Elena Vasquez entered precisely at 9 o'clock, commanding immediate attention. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled back severely, eyes that catalogued every face. Welcome to contemporary literature, Professor Vasquez began without preamble. Over the next semester, we'll explore how modern writers grapple with displacement, identity, and the search for meaning in an increasingly fragmented world. These are not comfortable texts. Maggie felt a thrill of recognition. This was what she'd hungered for. Intellectual challenge that assumed intelligence. Let's begin with Mrs. Dalloway, Professor Vasquez continued. Woolf's exploration of consciousness and time. What did you make of Clarissa's relationship with her own past? Hands shot up. A young man offered textbook analysis. A woman discussed modernist techniques with impressive fluency. The conversation flowed around Maggie like a river she hadn't yet learned to navigate. Then Professor Vasquez's eyes found hers. Ms. Coleman, Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. Margaret Coleman. Ms. Coleman, you've been quiet. What's your take on Clarissa's choices? The room went silent. 20 pairs of eyes assessed her. She could offer something safe, something that wouldn't mark her as different. Instead, she chose honesty. I think Clarissa understands something that youth can't fully grasp, she said slowly. The weight of unlived lives. Every choice we make closes doors, creates the ghost of who we might have been. Clarissa's entire day is haunted by alternate versions of herself. At middle age, you become acutely aware of all the selves you abandoned along the way. The silence felt different, attentive rather than polite. Professor Vasquez's eyebrows rose. Interesting. You're suggesting Woolf's exploration of consciousness is specifically tied to the experience of aging? I'm suggesting that regret has texture that can only be understood through lived experience, Maggie replied, gaining confidence. A 20-year-old can intellectualize paths not taken, but they can't feel the weight of decades of accumulated choices. Clarissa's melancholy isn't just literary device, it's the authentic voice of someone who's lived long enough to understand the complexity of any single life. A young woman leaned forward. But doesn't that perspective limit the universality of the text? Not limit, Maggie said. Layer. Great literature works on multiple levels. Young readers might connect with Clarissa's social anxiety, her observations about London, but there are depths that reveal themselves only with experience. That doesn't diminish the text, it enriches it. The discussion that followed was electric. Students engaged with Maggie's perspective, some challenging it, others building on it. When class ended, students filed out quickly. Maggie gathered her materials slowly, still processing what had happened. She'd not only participated, she'd contributed something valuable. Ms. Coleman, Professor Vasquez approached. Could I speak with you for a moment? Maggie's stomach clenched. Had she overstepped? That was excellent work today, the professor said. Your perspective on the relationship between age and literary understanding was quite insightful. Have you considered how that might inform your thesis work? Thesis work? Maggie blinked. I'm still adjusting to being back in school. Professor Vasquez smiled, the first genuine warmth Maggie had seen from her. I think you should consider it. There's real scholarship potential in exploring how life experience informs literary interpretation. Age as critical lens. It's an underexplored area. Walking across Harvard Yard afterward, Maggie felt intellectual exhilaration she hadn't experienced in years. Her mind buzzed with ideas, connections, possibilities beyond simple degree completion. Near the library, she noticed another older student, a distinguished Asian man with silver hair, studying a campus map with concentrated attention. Excuse me, she said, surprising herself with boldness. Are you looking for something specific? He looked up gratefully. Philosophy building. I'm afraid I'm still learning my way around. I just figured out where the literature building is, Maggie admitted. But I think philosophy is that way. Thank you. He smiled. I'm Marcus Chen, and you're clearly another member of the non-traditional student club. Margaret Coleman, though I prefer Maggie, and yes, definitely non-traditional. They walked together, conversation flowing easily. Marcus was a retired engineer who'd lost his wife 2 years ago and enrolled in philosophy courses to figure out what comes next. His honesty about grief and reinvention felt refreshing. "My children think I've lost my mind," Marcus confided. "Mine are split between thinking I'm brave and thinking I'm having a breakdown," Maggie replied. "But I suppose that's better than consensus that I'm crazy." His laugh was warm. "Perhaps we could grab coffee sometime. Compare notes on being the old folks on campus?" "I'd like that," Maggie said, and meant it. Walking back to her apartment, Maggie reflected on small victories. She'd survived her first class not just intact but energized. She'd contributed meaningfully to academic discussion. She'd made what might become friendship with someone who understood her situation. Most importantly, she'd begun to see herself not as an interloper, but as someone bringing valuable perspective to academic conversation. Her age wasn't a liability to overcome. It was an asset to leverage. The studio apartment felt less foreign. When she returned, more like temporary home than place of exile. Outside her window, Cambridge bustled with academic energy, and for the first time since arriving, Maggie felt like she belonged to it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "How was day 1? Tell me everything." Maggie smiled and began typing. There was so much to tell, so much to celebrate. For the first time in years, she had stories about her own life that had nothing to do with being someone's mother, someone's widow, someone's responsibility. She was, quite simply, Margaret Coleman, Harvard student, and that felt like enough. 3 weeks into the semester, Maggie had settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. Morning coffee while reviewing notes, the walk across Cambridge. That no longer required her map, classroom discussions that left her mind spinning with new ideas. In Professor Vasquez's post-colonial literature seminar, her confidence truly began to bloom. The professor announced group projects, sending ripples of anxiety through the classroom. "I'll be assigning pairs randomly," Professor Vasquez said, immune to the collective groan. "You're here to learn from different perspectives, not work with your friends." Maggie found herself paired with Zara Okafor, a 22-year-old pre-med student whose initial reaction was barely concealed dismay. During their first meeting at Widener Library, Zara's impatience was palpable as she checked her phone repeatedly. "So we're analyzing Adichie's Americana," Zara said without preamble, her Nigerian accent crisp. "I assume you've read it?" "Twice," Maggie replied mildly. "Once when it was published and again last week." Zara's eyebrows rose. "Right. I think we should focus on the immigration narrative, displacement theme. Very straightforward." "I was thinking about the hair," Maggie said. "The hair?" Zara's expression suggested Maggie had proposed analyzing font choices. Ife Melu's relationship with her natural hair as metaphor for authentic identity versus assimilation. The politics of black hair in white spaces, the psychological cost of conformity. Maggie pulled out her heavily annotated copy. When she first relaxes her hair for job interviews, Adichie isn't just talking about chemical treatment, she's exploring the violence of self-erasure. For the first time, Zara looked genuinely interested. "You think the hair represents broader themes of code switching?" "I think the hair is the story," Maggie said. "Every time Ifemelu changes her hair, she's negotiating her place in the world. Natural hair becomes an act of rebellion, but also a privilege. She can only afford authenticity once she's economically secure." Zara leaned forward, phone forgotten. "That's actually brilliant. I've been focusing on obvious immigrant experience stuff, but you're right. The hair is where the real psychological complexity lives." Their collaboration shifted after that moment. What had begun as grudging cooperation evolved into genuine intellectual partnership. Zara brought analytical rigor. Maggie contributed interpretive depth and what she'd begun thinking of as life perspective. the ability to recognize emotional complexity from decades of navigating identity compromises. "How do you see these things?" Zara asked during their third meeting, after Maggie identified another layer of meaning. "These connections that aren't obvious?" Maggie considered carefully. "Pattern recognition. When you've lived long enough, you see how the same human struggles repeat in different contexts. Adichie's characters are dealing with questions I've been asking for 40 years. Who am I when trying to fit in? How much of myself am I willing to sacrifice for acceptance? And you think that gives you better insight into literature?" "Different insight," Maggie corrected. "When Ifemelu struggles with whether to maintain her blog or conform to professional expectations, I recognize that choice. I've made versions of it my entire adult life." Zara nodded slowly. "I suppose I've been so focused on medical school that I haven't thought about those long-term questions yet." "You're already thinking about them," Maggie said gently. "Every time you code switch in a classroom, every time you decide how much of your Nigerian identity to reveal, you're living the same themes Adichie writes about." Their friendship deepened over coffee dates that stretched beyond academic necessity. Zara shared the pressure of being first generation, the weight of family expectations riding on her medical school ambitions, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while maintaining perfect grades. "My parents sacrificed everything for me to be here," Zara confided during one library session. "My father drives taxi 16 hours a day to pay tuition. They see my education as validation of their immigration, proof that leaving Nigeria was worth it." "That's a lot to carry," Maggie said. "Sometimes I feel like I'm performing their American dream rather than living my own life." Zara's voice was barely audible. "What if I hate being a doctor? What if I'm only pursuing medicine because it's what immigrants' children are supposed to do?" The vulnerability reminded Maggie of her younger self, the woman who'd abandoned graduate school, not because she didn't want it, but because wanting it felt selfish. "I gave up my academic dreams to be the wife and mother everyone expected," Maggie said carefully. "It wasn't wrong. I loved my family. Don't regret my choices. But I do wonder who I might have become if I'd been braver about disappointing people. And now you're finding out." "Now I'm giving myself permission to find out." Meanwhile, her friendship with Marcus Chen developed along different lines. Their weekly coffee meetings meandered from philosophy to grief to the peculiar experience of being older students in a youth-dominated environment. Marcus possessed a methodical mind that approached emotional challenges with engineering precision. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding authentic identity," he said during one of their walks along the Charles River. "My wife always said I compartmentalized too much. Work Marcus, husband Marcus, father Marcus. She wanted me to find some integrated version of myself. And now? Now I'm wondering if that integrated self was who I was supposed to become after she died. Maybe that's why I'm here, studying philosophy instead of playing golf like my son suggested." Maggie understood the subtext. Marcus was wrestling with the same questions of reinvention that had driven her to Harvard. "Your son thinks you should be playing golf?" Marcus's laugh was rueful. "He thinks I should be enjoying retirement, structured leisure activities with other widowed seniors. Philosophy at 67 strikes him as eccentric." "Sounds familiar," Maggie said. "Though my son uses words like irresponsible and delusional. The vocabulary of children who think they know what's best for their parents." Their shared understanding of family pressure created easy intimacy. Marcus became the person Maggie called when David's disapproving silences grew too heavy, when Sarah's worried phone calls made her question her choices. "I've been thinking about what you said about pattern recognition," Zara said during one study session, "about seeing the same human struggles in different contexts." "What about it?" "I think you're wrong about one thing. You keep talking about your age as giving you different perspective, but I think it gives you better perspective. More complete, anyway." "How so?" "Because you've lived through the consequences of choices." When you read about Ifamelu's dilemmas, you don't just understand the dilemma. You understand what happens after the choice is made. That's not just different insight. That's deeper insight. The observations stuck with Maggie. She'd been so focused on proving she belonged despite her age, that she'd forgotten to consider what her age brought that was valuable precisely because of the years. A phone call from Sarah interrupted her reflections. Her daughter's voice carried careful neutrality. "How are you settling in, Mom? Really?" "Really well," Maggie said, surprised to realize it was completely true. "I'm learning so much, not just academically, but about myself. David's been asking about you." The careful phrasing didn't fool Maggie. "David's been asking you to check on my mental state." Sarah's sigh confirmed her suspicion. "He's worried. He thinks if you're struggling, you won't admit it." "And what do you think?" "I think you sound happier than you have in years," Sarah admitted. "But also different. More yourself, if that makes sense." It did make sense. The woman in this tiny Cambridge apartment, surrounded by texts and new friendships, felt more authentically herself than she had in decades. Not Margaret the wife or mother or teacher, but simply Margaret, curious, intelligent, brave enough to start over at 65. "I'm making friends," she told Sarah. "Real friends, not just people I know through you kids or church. People who like me for who I am now, not who I used to be." After hanging up, Maggie sat thinking about the relationships she was building. Zara's fierce intelligence and vulnerability, Marcus's gentle wisdom and shared understanding of loss. For the first time in her adult life, she was choosing her relationships rather than inheriting them through marriage or motherhood. Her phone buzzed with a text from Zara. "Coffee tomorrow? Want to run something by you about the Adichie paper." Another from Marcus. "Philosophy of friendship discussion Thursday if you're interested." Maggie smiled as she responded. These people had chosen to include her in their lives, just as she'd chosen them. The relationships felt clean and uncomplicated by history or obligation. At 65, she was finally learning what it meant to be loved for who she was becoming rather than who she had been. October arrived with the brutal efficiency of New England autumn, stripping leaves from trees and exposing the bare bones of Cambridge's architecture. Maggie had been dreading this month, not for the weather, but for midterms. Her first major academic challenge in 40 years loomed like a thundercloud over her newfound confidence. The reading load had intensified. While she excelled at literary analysis, the technology requirements left her struggling. Research databases that her younger classmates navigated intuitively became labyrinthine puzzles. Citation software crashed repeatedly on her aging laptop. Simple tasks like uploading assignments to online portals consumed hours. "You're overthinking it," Zara said during one of their study sessions, watching Maggie wrestle with a digital archive search. "Here, let me show you." The ease with which Zara's fingers flew across the keyboard was both helpful and humbling. At 22, she'd never known a world without the internet. For Maggie, each new platform felt like learning a foreign language. Professor Vasquez's midterm exam arrived on a gray Tuesday morning that matched Maggie's mood. The 3-hour written examination demanded not just literary knowledge, but facility with theoretical frameworks she'd barely encountered as an undergraduate decades ago. Post-colonial theory, feminist criticism, deconstructionist approaches, terms that Zara wielded effortlessly but left Maggie feeling intellectually inadequate. She stared at the exam questions, her mind cycling through panic and self-doubt. Compare Spivak's concept of the subaltern with Morrison's treatment of voicelessness in Beloved. The words seemed to swim on the page. She understood Morrison's novel intimately, had taught it to high school students for years. But Spivak's dense theoretical language felt impenetrable. The exam room filled with the sound of furious typing from her classmates' laptops. Maggie's pen felt archaic in her hand as she struggled to formulate responses that demonstrated theoretical sophistication she wasn't sure she possessed. When time was called, she left the examination feeling hollowed out, certain she'd failed, spectacularly. The walk back to her apartment felt like a funeral march. She was drowning her sorrows in tea and self-recrimination when her phone rang. David's name on the screen made her stomach clench. "Mom, I'm in Boston on business. Thought I'd drive over to check on you." Check on her, not visit. Check on her, like a property requiring inspection. "That's not necessary, David. I'm fine." "Great. I'll be there in an hour." He hung up before she could protest, leaving Maggie to contemplate her tiny apartment through his eyes. The unmade Murphy bed, the books scattered across every surface, the general chaos of someone living, fully rather than neatly. Everything that felt like authentic life to her would probably look like decline to David. He arrived carrying flowers and wearing his concerned son expression, the one that had appeared whenever she'd seemed too tired during Frank's illness. His eyes cataloged the apartment's disorder with lawyer efficiency. "Mom, this place is small. It's what I need," she said, accepting the flowers with forced gratitude. "How are you really doing? And I want the truth, not the brave front you put on for Sarah." The question stung because it assumed deception. "I'm doing well, David, better than I have in years." His skeptical expression suggested he'd expected this response. "Mom, I talked to your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She says you've been gone for weeks. The house is sitting empty. This whole Harvard thing, it's not sustainable." "Mrs. Patterson is monitoring my absence?" "She's concerned. We all are." David settled into her single chair, making himself comfortable for what was clearly planned as an intervention. "Look, I understand you needed a change after Dad died. Grief makes people do impulsive things. But this fantasy has gone far enough." Fantasy. The word hit like a slap. "This isn't a fantasy, David. It's my life. It's escapism. You're running away from reality, from family, from responsibilities, from who you actually are." "And who am I, exactly?" Maggie's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You're a 65-year-old widow and grandmother who should be focusing on what's actually important. Rebecca needs stability in her life, not a grandmother having some kind of academic crisis." The mention of Rebecca triggered something protective in Maggie. "Rebecca supports my decision. She's excited about what I'm doing." "Rebecca is 16. She doesn't understand the implications of your choices." "Well, what implications?" David's composure cracked slightly. "What happens when you fail out? When you realize you can't compete with students a third your age? What happens when you end up alone in this shoebox apartment with nothing to show for it but debt and humiliation?" The words landed with surgical precision, finding every insecurity Maggie had been fighting. Because after this morning's exam, those fears felt entirely possible. "I won't fail," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Mom, you're struggling already. I can see it. You look exhausted, overwhelmed. This apartment looks like you're barely keeping your head above water." He wasn't wrong about the apartment, which felt especially chaotic after the morning's defeat. But his certainty about her failure ignited something fierce in Maggie's chest. "I had a difficult exam today," she admitted. "That doesn't mean I'm failing at life. It means you're in over your head, and too proud to admit it." David leaned forward, his voice gentling with what he probably thought was compassion. "There's no shame in coming home. We can find you some age-appropriate activities, maybe counseling to help process Dad's death properly." "Stop." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Stop talking about my choices like they're symptoms of mental illness. I'm trying to help you. You're trying to control me. The way you've been trying to control everyone around you since your father got sick." David's face went white. "That's not fair. Isn't it? You made decisions about Frank's care without consulting me. You decided what I should do with my time, my money, my future. You've spent 2 years treating me like an incompetent child who can't be trusted to manage her own life. Because you clearly can't. The words exploded from him with surprising vehemence. Look at this place. Look at what you've done. You've abandoned everything real for some impossible dream. A knock at the door interrupted his tirade. Maggie opened it to find Marcus and Zara standing in the hallway, concern written across their faces. We heard raised voices, Marcus said quietly. Wanted to make sure you were all right. The sight of her friends, people who knew and respected, the woman she was becoming, steadied something in Maggie's chest. I'm fine. David, these are my classmates. Marcus Chen and Zara Okafor. David's expression as he processed their ages was almost comical. Marcus, clearly a contemporary, extended his hand with dignified politeness. Zara's assessment of the situation was swift and unforgiving. You must be the son, she said, her accent sharpening with disapproval. We've heard about you. All good things, I hope, David replied with forced charm. Not particularly, Zara said with brutal honesty. The tension in the small apartment was suffocating. Marcus, ever diplomatic, attempted to diffuse it. Perhaps we should leave you to your family discussion. No, Maggie said firmly. David was just leaving. Her son stared at her as if she'd transformed into someone unrecognizable. Perhaps she had. This conversation isn't over, Mom. Yes, it is, she replied calmly. Because I'm not a child requiring your permission to live my life. After David left, the apartment felt larger somehow, as if his disapproval had been taking up physical space. Zara collapsed onto the small couch with dramatic flair. Well, that was intense. No wonder you came to Harvard. I'd run away from that energy, too. I didn't run away, Maggie said, but her voice lacked conviction after the morning's failures. Marcus studied her with careful attention. Difficult day before difficult family? The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She found herself telling them about the exam, about feeling intellectually outmatched, about David's accusations hitting uncomfortably close to her own fears. Theory is just vocabulary, Zara said dismissively. You understand the concepts. You just haven't learned the academic language yet. I can teach you that. And family members, Marcus added with gentle humor, often see only the version of us they're comfortable with. Change threatens their understanding of who we are, so they resist it. Their matter-of-fact support felt like oxygen after drowning. These people had chosen to be in her life based on who she was now, not who she used to be. Their faith in her felt more real than David's certainty of her failure. Thank you, she said simply. Both of you. As they left, promising to meet. Tomorrow for exam preparation, Maggie sat alone in her small apartment. David's words still stung, but they no longer felt like prophecy. She had failed an exam, not failed at life. She had friends who believed in her capacity to grow and learn. Tomorrow she would figure out Spivak and subaltern theory. She would master the technology that frustrated her. She would prove to herself, if not to David, that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. The morning after David's departure, Maggie woke with the hollow feeling of someone who'd survived a battle but wasn't sure they'd won. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Sarah and a text from Rebecca. Dad told me about his visit. Don't let him get in your head. You're amazing. She was still processing her granddaughter's surprising support when Professor Vasquez's email arrived, requesting a private meeting. Maggie's stomach clenched. The failed exam, David's predictions of humiliation. It all seemed to be converging toward the inevitable conversation where she'd be gently counseled to consider alternative paths. Professor Vasquez's office occupied a corner of the literature building, its walls lined floor to ceiling with books in multiple languages. The professor sat behind her desk, Maggie's exam visible on the surface between them. Ms. Coleman, thanks. You for coming. Professor Vasquez's voice was measured, professional. I wanted to discuss your midterm performance. Here it came. The compassionate dismissal, the suggestion that perhaps Harvard wasn't the right fit after all. I know it wasn't my best work, Maggie began, but Professor Vasquez raised a hand. Actually, I wanted to talk about what you did well. She pulled out the exam, pages marked with red ink that Maggie had assumed were corrections. Your analysis of Morrison's treatment of trauma and memory was sophisticated. Your close reading of the scene where Seth confronts her past showed real interpretive skill. Maggie blinked, confused. But the theoretical framework was lacking, yes. You struggled with Spivak's terminology, missed some key concepts in post-colonial theory. Professor Vasquez leaned forward. But Ms. Coleman, theoretical vocabulary, can be learned. What you demonstrated, the ability to see how literature functions emotionally and psychologically, that's much rarer. The praise felt surreal after yesterday's confrontation with David. I felt completely out of my depth. You're learning a new language, academic discourse that's evolved significantly since your undergraduate years. But underneath that struggle, I see someone with genuine insight into how literature works. Professor Vasquez pulled out another paper, which is why I want to discuss your final project. Final project? A research paper, 15 pages. I usually assign specific topics, but I'd like to offer you something different. What if you explored the relationship between age and literary interpretation? The way life experience shapes reading? Maggie's pulse quickened. You mean, writing about what I bring to literature because of my age, not despite it? Exactly. There's real scholarship potential here. How does a reader who's experienced grief read differently than one who hasn't? What do you see in texts about aging that younger scholars might miss? It's an underexplored field. The conversation transformed Maggie's understanding of her place at Harvard. She wasn't an imposter struggling to keep up. She was a scholar with a unique perspective worth exploring academically. Over the following weeks, she threw herself into the research with an intensity that surprised her. The project became personal and intellectual simultaneously, a way of understanding her own journey while contributing something new to literary scholarship. She spent hours in Widener Library, surrounded by texts about aging, memory, and the intersection of life experience. With artistic interpretation, authors like May Sarton, who wrote about creativity in later life. Academic papers on how older readers engage differently with narratives about mortality and meaning. You're like a woman possessed, Zara observed during one of their study sessions, watching Maggie emerge from a pile of books with ink-stained fingers and excited eyes. I think I finally found something that's genuinely mine, Maggie replied. Not just catching up to what everyone else knows, but contributing something new. Her research revealed patterns she'd never consciously recognized. The way she read, Virginia Woolf's exploration of time differently now than she had at 30. How Morrison's treatment of maternal guilt resonated with experiences unavailable to childless readers. The specific insights that came from having lived through loss, compromise, and the long arc of a complete relationship. Marcus became her sounding board for ideas, their coffee meetings evolving into intense discussions about the intersection of philosophy and lived experience. You're arguing that aging creates interpretive advantages, he said during one of their walks along the Charles River. That's radical in a youth-obsessed culture. Not advantages, Maggie corrected. Different capacities. A 20-year-old might see things in a text that I miss because they're not carrying my assumptions about how life works. But I see layers that require experience to recognize. Like what? The weight of choices. Young readers can understand that characters make decisions, but they haven't felt the decades of consequences that follow every major choice. When I read about a character choosing career over family, or passion over security, I don't just see the moment of decision. I see the 30 years that follow. Her enthusiasm for the project was infectious. Even her weekly calls with Sarah began to shift in tone. "You sound different, Mom," Sarah observed during one conversation. "More. I don't know. Energized?" "I found something I'm good at," Maggie said. "Something that's mine." "The research paper?" "The thinking. The discovery. I forgot how much I love learning." She paused. "I spent so many years focused on everyone else's growth. Yours and David's and Tommy's education, Frank's career, my students' development. I forgot that I have a mind that enjoys being challenged." The paper began taking shape, 15 pages that felt like the most important work she'd ever done. She wrote about reading King Lear differently after caring for a parent with dementia. About how her understanding of beloved deepened after experiencing the specific grief of losing someone gradually versus suddenly. Her argument was both personal and scholarly, that literary criticism needed to account for the reader's life, stage and experience. That age brought interpretive capacities worth recognizing and studying. 3 days before the paper was due, Rebecca called. "Grandma, I need advice about college applications." The conversation that followed surprised Maggie with its depth. Rebecca wasn't just asking about logistics, she wanted guidance about choosing authenticity over parental expectations, about having the courage to pursue interests that might disappoint others. "Dad wants me to apply to business programs," Rebecca confided. "Says liberal arts is impractical. But I love writing, love literature. Seeing what you're doing at Harvard, it makes me think maybe I don't have to choose the safe path." "What do you want to do?" "I want to study creative writing, maybe journalism, something that lets me tell stories." Rebecca's voice was small but determined. "Is that stupid?" "It's brave," Maggie said, "and difficult, and wonderful." "Will you help me? With my essays, I mean. Dad doesn't understand, but you do." The request felt like a gift, the opportunity to mentor someone else's journey toward authenticity. Of course. As November settled over Cambridge, Maggie found herself in a place she'd never expected. Confident in her academic abilities, surrounded by friends who valued her perspective, contributing something meaningful to scholarship. The woman who'd arrived in Cambridge feeling like an imposter had discovered she belonged here in ways she'd never imagined. The final paper submitted, she waited for Professor Vasquez's response with nervous excitement rather than dread. Whatever came next, she'd proven something important to herself. It was never too late to find your voice, even if that voice said things the world wasn't used to hearing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Coffee to celebrate surviving." "The semester?" Another from Zara. "Ready to hear about your paper grade?" Professor V looked impressed when she finished reading it. Maggie smiled, feeling the warmth of chosen family surrounding her academic achievements. At 65, she was finally living a life that felt authentically hers. Not the life others expected her to live, but the one she'd chosen to create. The semester wasn't over, but she'd already won something more valuable than grades. The knowledge that she could still grow, still surprise herself, still become more than she'd ever imagined possible. December arrived with heavy snow, transforming Harvard Yard into a winter wonderland. Maggie felt lighter than she had in months. Professor Vasquez had returned her research paper with an A- and a note. "Exceptional work. Have you considered submitting this for publication?" The possibility of being a published scholar at 65 felt surreal. But it was her evolving relationship with Marcus that occupied her thoughts as she walked to Widener Library. Their friendship had deepened into something that felt increasingly like more than friendship. Their conversations had become more personal, their walks along the Charles River longer and more intimate. But Maggie found herself pulling back whenever things veered toward acknowledging the growing tension between them. She found Marcus at their usual table, surrounded by philosophy texts. He looked up as she approached, his smile warming her in ways that made her feel guilty. "How did the meeting go?" he asked. "She wants me to consider submitting for publication," Maggie said, still hardly believing it. "That's wonderful. You should be celebrating." "I keep thinking Frank would have been so proud," she said, immediately feeling the weight of mentioning her late husband. Marcus's expression grew gentle. "He would have been. From everything you've told me, he loved your mind. He would have wanted this for you." They worked in comfortable silence, but Maggie found herself stealing glances at Marcus, his careful way of turning pages, the small frown of concentration between his eyebrows. At some point, she realized she'd stopped reading and was simply watching him. "Maggie?" His voice was soft. "You're staring." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Sorry, I was just thinking," he finished. "I know. I've been thinking too." The words hung between them, loaded with possibility. "Marcus, I know it's complicated," he said quietly. "We're both carrying ghosts, but I can't pretend I don't feel something when I'm with you." "I feel it too," she whispered. "But I don't know if I'm ready. I don't know if it's fair to Frank's memory." "What if being happy isn't a betrayal?" he asked gently. "What if it's exactly what the people who loved us would want?" Before she could respond, he reached across and brushed his fingers against her cheek. When his lips touched hers, it was gentle, questioning, not desperate passion, but something deeper. Recognition, companionship, the careful hope of two people who'd thought they were finished with love. The kiss lasted only a moment before Maggie pulled back, her heart hammering. "I can't," she whispered, even though every part of her wanted to lean back into his arms. "I'm not ready." She fled the library, her emotions churning. Later, over coffee, Zara provided perspective. "You're describing fear, not grief," Zara said gently after hearing about the kiss. "What if choosing to be happy again is exactly what someone who loved you would want?" 3 days later, Sarah visited. The conversation over dinner revealed her real purpose. "David asked me to evaluate whether you're making sound decisions," Sarah admitted as they walked back to Maggie's apartment. "He's still worried about your judgment." The betrayal stung. "And what will you tell him?" "I'll tell him you're the happiest I've seen you in years, and that maybe the rest of us need to examine why that threatens us so much." Later, alone. In her apartment, Maggie thought about Marcus, about the possibility of love after loss. Sarah's visit had clarified something important. She was tired of living according to other people's timelines. She picked up her phone and typed, "Can we talk? I think I'm ready to figure this out together." The response came quickly. "I've been hoping you'd say that." At 65, Maggie was learning that the heart didn't follow convenient schedules. Love arrived when it chose to, regardless of whether you felt ready. The question wasn't whether she deserved happiness after Frank. It was whether she had the courage to reach for it. 2 weeks after Sarah's visit, Maggie was enjoying a quiet Saturday morning with Marcus at their favorite cafe when her phone rang. David's name on the screen made her stomach clench, but it was his first words that told her everything. "Sarah. Told me about your boyfriend." The word dripped with contempt. Maggie glanced at Marcus, who was reading the newspaper but clearly aware of the tension radiating from her phone. "His name is Marcus," she said evenly. "And he's not—" "I'm driving up there," David interrupted. "We need to have a serious conversation about what you're doing with your life." "David, that's not necessary. I'll be there in 3 hours." The line went dead. Maggie stared at her phone, feeling the familiar weight of David's disapproval settling over her like storm clouds. "Family crisis?" Marcus asked gently. "My son. He's not pleased about us." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you want me to be there when he arrives?" The offer was tempting, But Maggie shook her head. This is something I need to handle myself. David arrived precisely when promised, his jaw set in the expression Maggie recognized from his childhood tantrums. But this wasn't a child's anger. This was the cold fury of a man who'd built his identity on control and found it slipping away. "We're going to dinner," he announced without preamble. "Somewhere we can talk privately." He chose an upscale restaurant in Harvard Square, the kind of place where raised voices would attract unwanted attention. Maggie realized this was calculated. He expected her to be more manageable in public. They ordered in tense silence. Then David launched his assault. "Mom, this has gone far enough. First the ridiculous college fantasy. Now you're playing house with some stranger you barely know. You're embarrassing yourself and our family." "I'm living my life," Maggie replied calmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "Something I haven't done in a very long time. You're having a breakdown. A very public, very humiliating breakdown." David leaned forward, his lawyer voice in full effect. "Dad's been dead barely 18 months, and you're already replacing." "Kim? What kind of message does that send to your grandchildren?" The accusation hit like a physical blow. "I'm not replacing Frank. I'm not trying to replace Frank." "Then what do you call it? Moving in with some old man, playing student like you're 20 again." "I haven't moved in with anyone. And I am a student. A successful one." Maggie's voice carried an edge that made David pause. "I'm thriving, David. For the first time in years, I'm truly happy." "Happy?" David's laugh was harsh. "You're living in a shoebox apartment, wasting Dad's insurance money on some fantasy degree, dating a stranger. His name is Marcus Chen. He's a widower, a retired engineer, a philosophy student. He's kind and intelligent and treats me like an adult capable of making her own choices. Unlike your family? Unlike you." The words came out sharper than intended, but Maggie didn't take them back. David's face flushed red. "I'm trying to protect you from making catastrophic mistakes. Someone has to be the adult here. I am an adult. A 65-year-old adult who doesn't need permission from her children to live her life." "You're dishonoring Dad's memory," David said, playing what he clearly thought was his trump card. "Running off to play college student, shacking up with some stranger. Dad would be ashamed." The restaurant seemed to go quiet around them. Other diners glanced over, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension at their table. Maggie looked at her eldest son, this man she'd raised, loved, supported through law school and marriage and divorce, and felt something crystallize inside her. Something that had been building for months, maybe years. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice low and deadly calm. "Use your father's memory to justify your need to control me. Frank fell in love with my mind, with my dreams, with my potential. He mourned with me when I gave up graduate school, even though he never asked me to. He would celebrate this decision, not condemn it. He'd want you home, with your family. He'd want me to be happy. He'd want me to live fully, to love again if I found someone worthy of it. He'd want me to be the woman he fell in love with, curious, brave, growing." David stared at her as if she'd become a stranger. "This isn't you, Mom. This isn't who you are." "You're wrong," Maggie said quietly. "This is exactly who I am. I just forgot for a while." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, David spoke, his voice tight, with controlled emotion. "If you continue down this path, if you keep embarrassing our family with this midlife crisis, I can't support it. I won't enable this delusion." "Then don't," Maggie replied calmly. "But also don't expect me to live my life according to your timeline for my grief or your definition of appropriate behavior for widows." David threw his napkin on the table and stood. "I'm done. When this falls apart, when your boyfriend takes advantage of you and you fail out of your pretend college, don't come crying to me." "I won't." Maggie said simply. He stormed out of the restaurant, leaving Maggie alone at the table with the wreckage of their relationship. She sat for a long moment, processing what had just happened. She'd lost something tonight, her eldest, son's approval, the illusion of family unity, the safety of being the mother everyone expected her to be. But she'd gained something too. Her voice, her right to define her own life. The knowledge that she could stand up for her choices even when the cost was enormous. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tommy. Just heard from David. Driving up from Richmond. Be there in 4 hours. Another from Rebecca. Whatever Dad said, ignore him. You're my hero, Grandma. Maggie smiled through the tears she didn't realize she'd shed. The battle wasn't over, but she'd won something crucial tonight. The right to be herself, regardless of who approved or disapproved. At 65, she was finally learning that living authentically meant accepting that not everyone would understand or support your choices, but the people who truly loved you would find a way to celebrate your courage, even when they didn't. Understand your path. 6 months later, Maggie stood in Professor Vasquez's classroom preparing for her final presentation. But this wasn't the same woman who'd arrived at Harvard trembling with uncertainty. The gray-haired student adjusting her notes possessed a confidence that came from surviving storms and discovering what remained standing. The semester had ended with triumph. Her research paper on age and literary interpretation accepted for publication in a respected academic journal. Professor Vasquez had quietly suggested she consider doctoral studies, a conversation that would have seemed impossible a year ago, but now felt like a natural next step. Ready? Marcus asked from the front row, his smile warm with pride and something deeper. Their relationship had deepened over the winter months into genuine partnership. They'd taken their time, honoring their grief while allowing something new to grow between them. It wasn't the desperate passion of youth, but something richer. Love seasoned with wisdom and appreciation for second chances. Ready, Maggie replied, meaning it completely. The classroom filled with familiar faces. Zara sat near the window, no longer the impatient pre-med student who'd been reluctant to work with her grandmother's contemporary. Their friendship had evolved into mutual mentorship, Zara learning about life's long arc while Maggie absorbed the younger woman's fearless approach to challenge. Zara had switched her major to medical anthropology, inspired partly by their conversations about cultural perspectives on aging and healing. Other classmates filled the seats, young scholars who'd come to value Maggie's contributions to their discussions, who'd learned that insight came from unexpected sources. She was no longer the elderly interloper, but simply Margaret Coleman, whose voice mattered in academic conversation. Professor Vasquez introduced her with genuine respect. Ms. Coleman will be presenting her research on reading through time, how life experience transforms literary interpretation. Her work represents groundbreaking scholarship in reader response theory. Maggie began her presentation, weaving together months of research with personal insight. She discussed how her reading of King Lear had evolved after caring for Frank through his illness, how Morrison's exploration of maternal sacrifice resonated differently after decades of motherhood, how understanding literary aging required, having lived through the complexity of accumulated choices. Literature isn't just text meeting reader, she concluded. It's text meeting the full weight of a reader's lived experience. Age doesn't diminish interpretive capacity. It layers it with complexity that youth cannot access. We need critical frameworks that honor this depth rather than dismissing it as bias. The applause was genuine, enthusiastic. Professor Vasquez's questions pushed her thinking further, and Maggie found herself engaging with theoretical challenges that would have intimidated her months earlier. After class, as students filed out discussing final exams and summer plans, Maggie packed her materials with the satisfaction of work well done. Her phone buzzed with messages of support, texts from Rebecca, who was now confidently pursuing creative writing at a small liberal arts college despite David's continued disapproval. Knocked it out of the park, as usual, came Rebecca's message, followed by, Dad's still being stubborn, but Sarah's working on him. Tommy says give him time. The family healing had been gradual, uneven. David maintained his wounded silence, though Sarah reported signs of softening. He'd attended Rebecca's high school graduation, but avoided mentioning Maggie's Harvard achievements. Tommy had become her strongest advocate, driving up monthly to visit and bringing stories of Rebecca's college success that mirrored Maggie's own academic journey. Sarah's transformation had been the most surprising. Her daughter had returned to Cambridge twice more, each visit revealing greater appreciation for the life Maggie had built. During the last visit, Sarah had admitted, "Watching you change your life at 65 made me realize I don't have to wait until I'm your age to make changes in mine." She'd started taking evening painting classes, rediscovering creativity. She'd abandoned for practical pursuits, but it was her relationship with Marcus that provided the deepest satisfaction. They'd moved slowly, carefully, respecting their histories while building something new. His apartment near the Philosophy Building had become a second home, filled with books and long conversations that stretched through Cambridge evenings. "So," Marcus said as they walked across Harvard Yard after her presentation, "ready for the next adventure?" Professor Vasquez had officially invited Maggie to pursue doctoral studies, a 3-year commitment that would transform her from student to scholar. At 66, the prospect of earning a PhD felt both audacious and natural. "Are you ready?" Maggie countered. Marcus had received similar encouragement from his philosophy professors, and they'd tentatively discussed coordinating their graduate timelines. "I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as it includes you," he said simply. They stopped walking, facing each other in the middle of the yard where Maggie had first felt like an imposter among confident young students. Now it felt like home, a place where her mind belonged, where her voice mattered, where she could continue growing. Her phone rang. Sarah's name on the screen brought a smile. "Mom, I have news," Sarah said without preamble. "David's been asking questions about your graduation ceremony next week, about whether family is invited." Maggie's heart jumped. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that his mother is graduating from Harvard with highest honors, that her research is being published, and that maybe it's time he decided whether his pride is more important than his relationship with you. And he's thinking about it, which, for David, is progress." After hanging up, Maggie stood with Marcus in the fading light of late spring, surrounded by the campus that had become the setting for her transformation. Whether David came to graduation or not, whether he ever accepted her choices or not, she'd built a life that felt authentically hers. She thought about the woman who'd sat in David's dining room a year ago, being told to act her age and accept the narrow boundaries of widowhood. That woman had been drowning in other people's expectations, lost in roles that no longer fit. The woman standing in Harvard Yard had learned that age could be an asset rather than a limitation, that it was never too late to discover who you were meant to become. She'd found love after loss, friendship across generations, and academic success that honored both her mind and her experience. "Ready to go home?" Marcus asked. Maggie looked around the yard one more time, then smiled. "I am home," she said. "For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong." At 66, Margaret Coleman had finally learned the most important lesson of all, the courage to write your own story, regardless of who thought you were too old to hold the pen. And her story, she realized with deep satisfaction, was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.